Good evening. Welcome to another of the University Lecture Series presentations. And I want to commend all the students who came out tonight. I think you're braver than some of the faculty members since this is Dead Week. This evening we have a rather interesting format involved that can involve you over a longer period than just here. After we have the presentation and take time for questions and exchange with the speaker, we're going to adjourn to the grub stake for an informal reception, and any of you who can come along there are invited as well. This evening we have a speaker who was originally scheduled to come here in December and speak in conjunction with the World Affairs. At that time, however, he had to go to Cuba, and so he had to cancel with us, and now he's coming here. Our speaker is Kirby Jones. He is, as he describes himself, a generalist. In a sense, he began, I guess, his career as a Peace Corps participant in the Dominican Republic, and after that experience proceeded to become involved in Washington under the Kennedys. He worked directly with Robert Kennedy, and then in 1972 he served as Senator McGovern's press secretary. More recently, and I guess currently, his connection is entirely with, primarily with Cuba. He, along with Frank Mackovitz in 1974, had the first U.S. interview with Castro, and subsequently he has returned to Cuba on numerous occasions to become involved in discussions with Fidel Castro concerning establishing trade ties, future trade ties, with United States corporations. Tonight, the title of his address or lecture, along with a film which he will present, is Kirby Jones Inside Cuba with Fidel. Mr. Jones.
Thank you very much. Driving in, I was informed that it's exam week next week, and I have only two comments on that. One, great bravery of anybody who comes out and doesn't study. My second thought was, thank God I don't have to take any exams anymore. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Cuba tonight and about Fidel Castro, and show a film in a few minutes, which I'll get to in a moment, and tell you a little bit about how the film was made, and not so much what you're going to see, because I'd rather let the film speak for itself, but give you a little background. When one thinks of Cuba, and in preparation for looking at the film, the image of Cuba, everybody carries their own images of Cuba. Those who were there before Castro took power maybe think of the fun and the beaches and the gambling, the clubs, vacations, the good times, the nice business. Word democracy was thrown around, free world, anti-communism. That all changed. And then in 1959, revolution came to pass. And then one began to think of beards and guns and mass trials and communism, Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis, Che, raging anti-American speeches, fatigues, political prisoners, Russia, totalitarianism, military dictatorship. That has given way to newer terms of Angola and CIA assassinations and anti-Zionism in the Third World. Whether Cuba killed Kennedy or did not kill Kennedy. And the one thread that runs through in the last 17 years is Fidel Castro, who embodies many of those images. And people remember him last, perhaps, in the U.S. when he came to the United Nations session in the early 60s. And went to the Waldorf Astoria, where the Cuban delegation was supposed to stay, and they demanded payment in advance. And Fidel asked him, as a 32-year-old head of state, in his fatigues in the lobby of the Waldorf, said, "Are you asking for advance payment from any other country?" And they said no. And he said, "Well, I'm not staying here." And he took his chickens and his corps of fatigue advisors and went up to the Teresa Hotel in Harlem. It caused another stir. And when I first went to Cuba in 1974, in July of 1974, I spent a month there and spent 3 weeks making this film you're about to see, and spent about 4.5, 5 days doing a formal interview with Fidel on camera, part of which you'll see, and driving around in a Jeep, and we had drinks together and ate lunch together in very fancy restaurants. And what struck me as I went through Cuba, and particularly as I met Fidel, was the difference between what I had been led to believe I was going to see and what I actually saw, and particularly in the type of person that Fidel Castro is. One remembers the films of the bombastic speeches in front of 1 million people. He still speaks to 1 million people. The speeches are a little bit less bombastic. But when you meet Fidel, and I'll tell you a little bit about the first day I met him. We had been invited down to do an interview, and we spent 3.5 weeks and did not hear a peep from Fidel Castro. And it got to the night before we were supposed to leave, and we were literally packing, when word came from his office asking whether we could stay an extra week. And we, I might admit, grumbled and groaned. And we were informed the next day he would pick us up. And they said, "Have everything ready, wait in your hotel room, you'll be called." And sure enough, about 10 o'clock, the phone call came, and we were instructed to be downstairs right away. He's on his way over. And we're standing in front of the Hotel Riviera, which is the old Meyer Lansky Hotel, featured in Godfather 2. And we're standing there waiting for this head of state to come, not knowing quite how he was to arrive. Well, we looked left, and up the circular driveway came 2 Jeeps. And the first thing you saw in the front seat was this man with a beard. And the first thought I had was, that's Fidel Castro, and he really does have a beard. And he really does wear those fatigues. And he gets out of the car, and the second thing you notice is that the fatigues are very soft cloth, hand-tailored, fit immaculately. If there was a Brooks Brothers making fatigues, he would be wearing them. And the boots were spit-shined, zippered, fancy, elegant boots. And he had the gun, and he doffed his cap and shook hands, and he said, "Let's go for a ride." So I got in the back seat, and Frank Mankiewicz with me. He got in the back seat, and the man who always travels with Fidel got in the back seat. There were 3 of us in the back seat. The producer of our film, Saul Landau, was instructed to get in the front seat. And an aide turned around and said, "But Fidel, there's no room for the driver." And Fidel says, "Oh, hell, I'll drive." And in the Jeep, and off the 5 of us went. We drove through Havana, and people waved and said hello. We went to a restaurant and had drinks and made plans for the movie. But it was an introduction to a man that I had not expected, and indeed signaled a style which I have come to believe is indeed the style of Fidel Castro. He's a very soft-spoken, well-read man who has very strong ideas about lots of things, many of which I disagree with. But it's different from the image that had been projected to me. And the film hopefully will convey some of that. And I might just tell one more story by way of introduction to the film, one I told earlier today. The film that you saw, part of which was shown on CBS. They had bought the rights to the film. And when we returned after our month of July in September to do the follow-up interview and to complete the film, there were a bunch of journalists down there, and CBS had called down and said that if any of those journalists who were with Senators Pell and Javits who were visiting got a chance to ask Fidel Castro a question, our deal was off, which meant an instantaneous financial loss of $80,000, which was the cost of making the film. We talked to our Cuban friends and indeed discovered that Fidel was going to have a meeting with Pell and Javits, and indeed the 25 journalists were going to be there. And the Cubans assured us that the journalists would not ask any questions because they had been instructed not to, that it was a picture-taking session. Well, both Frank and I, who have been around journalists a great deal of time, knew better, that you never have a politician, much less a head of state, around American journalists where somebody doesn't ask a question and instructions are no. The meeting was scheduled for 8:30, and Frank and I were in our hotel room wondering what to do. And at 7:30 there was a knock on the door, and I went to open the door, and there was Fidel. And he walked in, and he said, "I've got to go see these senators in an hour, and see these journalists, but I wanted to talk to you guys first." And we sat down and asked about Pell and asked about Javits and talked a little bit about making arrangements the next night to do our last interview. And he said, "What should I do about these journalists?" And we said, "Mr. Prime Minister, we understand that you may decide to answer their questions because it's in your self-interest to do so, and it's in the self-interest of your country to do so, and we understand that. But we want you to understand that if you answer any questions, our project is finished and we will be financially ruined." And he sort of stroked his beard and nodded and looked at his watch and said, "My God, it's 8:30, I gotta go." So he runs down the hall, down the elevator, went to his office, and sure enough, escorted Pell and Javits into his study, which is alongside his office, where the journalists and the cameras began whirring and the pictures, the cameramen began taking their pictures. And a journalist raised his hand, said, "Mr. Prime Minister, why won't you answer our questions? What about relations with the United States?" which was the key theme of the moment. And Castro said, "Can't answer that question." He said, "I've given my word for an exclusive interview with 2 other journalists. And if I answer your question, they will be financially ruined." And one journalist said, "Is that Mankiewicz-Jones group?" And Fidel said, "Matter of fact, it is." And the New York Times guy, who has since not talked to me in the last 2 years, said, "But we're professionals. We're the professionals, and they're only amateurs." And Fidel paused and thought for a minute and said, "You know, you might be right. In fact, I think you are right. They may be amateurs, but they got the interview, didn't they? See you guys later." So the existence of this film is owed partly to that part of Fidel Castro that understands the capitalist system. The film, a couple other words. The film, we had total freedom to go anywhere we wanted to, had total freedom to talk to whomever we wanted to. There were no restrictions placed on where we were to film, who we were to film. In the interview, no questions were submitted in advance. Fidel answered every question put to him. And our purpose in the interview was not necessarily to challenge him, but to draw out from him his view not only of Cuba, but of the world and of the United States. The film is about Cuba. The words, the narration, is taken from the interview, and it's a film designed to present Fidel Castro's view of Cuba. Not mine, not Frank Mankiewicz's, not any historians, not any view based on either or, this or that, but to give him an opportunity and a vehicle to present his view, how he views his country before and now. And so why don't we look at the film, and then we'll talk a little bit afterwards, if there's a projectionist. Yes, question. This film was shot in July and September 1974. think in discussing Cuba, one has to keep a couple things in mind. One is that Cuba cannot be compared to the United States. It's an unfair comparison. I would not like to live in Cuba for all sorts of reasons, most of which probably have to do with the fact that I'm as a prisoner of my own McDonald's hamburgers and watching Kojak at night and the other niceties that we get accustomed to or trapped into as anybody else. And living in Cuba is damn difficult. And to compare it to the United States is unfair. But people do. It has to be compared in the context in which it is, and it's a Latin country. And compared to other Latin countries, to live in Cuba is a very different situation. Those of you who have been overseas and have been in Latin countries perhaps are struck by some of the same things I am, which is the wring and the desperate misery which people see all over the streets, whether they be beggars or prostitutes or the packed-in thousands of people that live in barrios or favelas or barriadas or whatever they're called that always ring the Latin cities. You don't find that in Cuba. You don't find what you find in other countries, which you see on the faces of women, which is the tortured look of the pressure that they are under particularly. Latin women, it's been my experience, have a very difficult life. They have the same worries that anybody else has about their family, about their children. And they have to do a lot of very hard physical labor. They have to cope with all sorts of strange circumstances. In Cuba, a lot of those worries have indeed been eliminated. You have families in Cuba who are not worried about where their food is coming from, who indeed are not worried that their children are going to get educated, who are not worried of what happens when their child gets sick, and women who can concentrate on one, making their home better, and two, actually getting themselves into the workforce and making a serious economic and social contribution to their country, which many women in other Latin countries can't do. So the comparison with the United States is unfair. And the reality of Cuba, how do you communicate that? How do you tell people that I believe I have not been given show tours of Havana? I've been there 20 times in Cuba and go anywhere I want. I speak Spanish, and I think I'm as capable as anybody else, and indeed perhaps a little more so in knowing what I'm being hoodwinked and what I'm not. But there's certain real things which you can't avoid. I'll come to the political issues in a minute because they're also important. But you cannot avoid what that family was talking about at the end, which indeed reflects what those people believe, that the literacy has been essentially eliminated. Fidel talked about 30%. Well, it's now down to about 3%. And indeed, hospitals are being built in the most remote corners of Cuba, that schools are indeed built in the most remote corners of Cuba, that the neglect of Havana, the downtrodden hotels and the old cars that we've read about for so long, they exist, but not out of an act of neglect, quite the contrary, out of an act of commission and a decision to neglect them. And that the traditional fancied up road between the airport and the hotels, where it's surrounded by the shopping centers and the movie theaters and the nightclubs, which you see in other Latin cities, where the American visitor goes to the tourist hotel and sits at the swimming pool, but never gets out of the confines of that narrow strip through the city, that in Cuba, that part of it there was a conscious decision to neglect it and to start spreading the wealth, or the lack of wealth, which is more important, equally. And there's a lot of lacks. Food is rationed, but the government minister and vice minister with a family of four has the same ration book as the factory worker with a family of four, which means that one can accept what there isn't a lot better if one knows that everybody has to accept it. There has been a great leveling process. There's no question that the rich before had their lives taken away from them. Either they left, or indeed their bank assets were frozen, their land was nationalized, and they were given the ration card the same as everybody else. The country club and the yacht club and the swimming pools and the golf courses were closed, changed into community centers. The gambling was closed, and the hotels were open to everybody. So the rich now have to stand in line along with everybody else. And that people don't like. And indeed, they left. And people talk about Fidel and Cuba being an exporter of revolution. He is the greatest exporter of the opposition. And let 700,000 potential enemies is the wrong word, but 700,000 people who are potentially adversaries leave the country, which leaves you with a 10% decline in population, but leaves you with a rather homogeneous society to a great extent, where you talk about a dictatorship. Yes, it's a dictatorship, but is it totalitarian? No. Is it military? No. And you drive along the streets and you don't see traffic cops, you don't see policemen, you don't see the machine guns, because in reality, they don't need them, because there's very few people really to police, because most of those people and the leaders, quite frankly, have left, or some are in jail and were jailed for making efforts against the government. You have what the rich used to enjoy, the nightclubs. You saw some of the nightclubs. All those are still functioning. The only difference is that everybody goes to the nightclubs. And they're expensive, but people have spendable income. A family that makes, let's say, 250 pesos or dollars a month with 2 children is limited on what he can spend, simply because there's not that much to buy. So when you have a situation where the education is free, where the medical care is free, well, rent and your housing is limited to 10% of your income, which is $24. Phones cost $5 a month. Bus transportation is a nickel. Public pay phones used to be free, but now cost a nickel. Where food is rationed, you're left at the end, and if your kids go to school, go to a boarding school, a secondary school, they get free food and board and room, you're left with a lot of spendable income, and people go to those nightclubs and are willing to spend $45, $50 a piece a night in nightclubs. So at the same time that people have been forced to share what there isn't, now share what there is. And this you don't find in other Latin countries. Education, Fidel talked about education. You talk to people down there and ask them what the revolution has meant to them. And to the new generation, it's obvious. They've grown up under Fidel Castro. They did not know what went on before. They have no real measure of comparison. They go to school. There is no limit on the heights to which they can rise, save their own personal limitations. But you talk to, for example, a waiter in a hotel and ask him what's the difference before you waited on Meyer Lansky and now you wait on Jaime Garcia. What difference does it make to you? And he says, that's true, I'm still a waiter, and I've been a waiter for 25 years. But the difference is that now my children are taken care of. And you ask him about, well, what about the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech and freedom of dissent? And he does back off a little bit on that. But he will say to you, look, he said, we never really had those things before. He said, under Batista, that wasn't freedom. He said, you Americans called it freedom because Batista was your friend. But we Cubans, there was no freedom of the press or freedom of speech before. People were thrown in jail. And the question comes up when you talk about freedoms, and I talked about this earlier this afternoon with a group, is how do you measure freedoms? Are we as Americans, growing up in a rather affluent society, capable of measuring what freedom is, having never known what it's like to live in a shack, what it's like to go hungry, what it's like not to have a job, what it's like not to have clothes, what it's like to walk 4 or 5 miles for a pail of water. and you ask that person now, that Cuban now, who has moved into one of the new apartments, has a job, his kids go to school and get free medical care, try to convince him that he should turn that in and, quote, have what we consider to be freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and you're going to get one hell of an argument. And it's a question of whether we are able to judge what sort of society, what sort of, quote, freedoms other people should have. Is freedom of speech or the press more important than freedom from being hungry? Well, I'm not prepared to make that judgment because I've never been hungry. But it's a judgment which Americans tend to make and which journalists tend to make in measuring what is good and what is bad from many other countries. There's no question that there are political prisoners. There are not only 8 Americans in jail down there, but a number of Cubans in jail. How many? I don't think anybody really knows. Fidel undoubtedly knows. And there's not much to say about that. They believe that those people should be in jail, and probably some of them should be, if one agrees with the thesis that to actively take up guns and work against a government in a violent fashion, if that is illegal, and it is in most countries, then they should be in jail, and there are many of those people in jail. And you talk to people about counter-revolutionary behavior, and can somebody go in the street corner and set up a soapbox and start talking? They will tell you, yes, that person can do that. It doesn't happen very often, certainly not anymore. There is tremendous peer pressure, and you talk about a totalitarian state and having police and spies and neighborhood vigilantes going around. They don't really need that, because the social system and the criteria for acceptance is now so ingrained in that society that the peer pressure of the neighborhood is not to do that. And as one Cuban said, if a person got up and did that, he would be laughed at rather than rounded up. And I suspect that's probably true. If he took a gun out and started armed struggle, he would be locked up. But political prisoners, they admit that they're there, and they are there. And then it's just a question of one gets into philosophical arguments whether they should be there. Cuba is a dictatorship, no question about that. Fidel Castro is indeed in control. And we asked him, it didn't appear in the interview, but we asked him, we were talking during the interview about the decision-making process within the government. And he went through this long, elaborate scheme of this committee and this group and this secretariat and the role of the party, and finally, getting through all of that, he said, but the political bureau, which is now 12 people, really makes the key decisions, which it does. And he is head of that political bureau. And we asked him whether there had ever been a suggestion of his that was not adopted by that political bureau. And he sat back in his chair and stroked his beard and thought for a minute and said, you know, that could happen. Implication being that it hadn't happened up to that point, and not likely to happen. He is firmly in control, and he's going to be there for a long, long time. And I think the response that you saw in the movie of the people as he walked around, those people were not actors. They were not from central casting. We went many, many places, very spontaneous, to the beach here, to apartments, to rum factories, all over the place. And people would greet him like a combination of a long-lost uncle returning with a little bit of savior thrown in and a little bit of sort of the normal respect one gives to a head of state. But people coming up and touching him and giving him abrazos and hugs and calling him Fidel is very, very common. And it's not at all unusual to be in Havana and see his Jeep or his car going up and down the street. He is a very visible sort of person. Again, very unlike the normal head of state. The communism issue. Cuba is communist, and people do read Lenin and Marx and carry books around, and there are classes going on all the time. There are about 100,000 members of the Communist Party out of a population of almost 10 million. Not very many. It's by selection. It's a very elite sort of group. But when you talk to Fidel about communism and about Leninism and about theory, you get the feeling that you're talking about that one topic that he hates to talk about. He knows what he's supposed to say, and he says what appears to me to be the right things. But when you get into the intricate discussions about the disappearance of the state and the changing from capitalism to socialism to communism and what happens really when the state disappears. I mean, there's no government, and he gets very uncomfortable handling that. Sure, everybody's in school to give them jobs and to provide the necessities of life on a comfortable, if not acceptable level. Then what is next? What are the people going to want? It's unusual for people in a country, and historically, people have wanted a slightly bigger TV set, or a different color refrigerator, or a new car. And I've asked this question a lot about how you're going to avert the consumer ethic. And you get varying answers. The lower level you get in the bureaucracy, the stronger the Marxist explanation is. And the higher level you get, and the more sort of furrowed brows. And it is a problem. Fidel says we're building a new man, and that man will not be interested in the consumer items. He'll be interested in serving the state. Well, that's probably true now, to a great extent. Whether it will last or not is one of the big questions of Cuba. If I were a betting man, I wouldn't bet on it. But on the other hand, if there ever was a country, at least that I've seen, that has the best chance of doing that, and that is what they want to do, Cuba probably has a pretty good crack at it. Internationally, the future is very interesting, I think. I think Cuba now, and Fidel Castro, is a major influence in the third world for a whole variety of reasons. One, and perhaps most importantly, he has bucked the United States. He has defeated them militarily on its own soil in the Bay of Pigs and in Africa and Angola. He has stood up in the face of not only military invasion, but CIA invasions and assassination plots and economic blockades and swine flu in their pigs, powder for his boots, and exploding seashells and everything else we've thrown at him. And they have not only survived, but have survived quite well, to the point where if you begin to start in their community in the Caribbean, Cuba is the major power in the Caribbean. One, not only because of its size, it's the biggest island, but the economic power, and certainly the military power, makes it a country to deal with. And you're now finding Trinidad and Jamaica and Barbados all grasping that and joining Cuba instead of fighting it. Even the Dominican Republic, which is a very reactionary country, now is beginning to send out signals. Latin America has come to grips with Cuba, and a number of countries trade and have good diplomatic relations. A number of them don't. In Africa, I think Cuba's role in Angola has, in terms of its foreign policy, probably been a success. That at least nobody can say that Cuba doesn't do what they say they're going to do. And when Castro talks about solidarity with his fighting brothers, he now has an example of what solidarity means. And the U.S. is an interesting situation, because if you remember back in the 60s, in the early 60s, the purpose of the U.S. blockade was to isolate Cuba, not allow its economy to develop, and to bring down Fidel Castro, all of which have failed. And the result is that we are isolated. We are the only major non-communist power in the world that doesn't have relations with Cuba. It's the last vestige of the Cold War. And I think things were happening in 1975, but the problem came is that Henry Kissinger personalized his foreign policy so much and got very upset the fact that some bearded, fatigued ragamuffin from a small island in the Caribbean rubbed his nose in the dirt in Angola. But I think now with the Carter administration, we're seeing a very rapid new direction and a new policy. Vance and Carter have made statements that they want to talk to Cuba and they want to renegotiate various treaties, that it's time, that there are no preconditions. Castro has sent back signals, both privately and publicly, that indeed he's ready to talk. And I think because Cuba has not only survived and because they feel confident in themselves, that now they can deal with the U.S. on a position of equality. And it's the U.S. Foreign policy interests that are served in many ways more than Cuba's in terms of coming to grips with Cuba. So I expect in the near future, we're going to see relations opening, we're going to see tourism opening. I think all of you should go to Cuba, particularly in the winter. I can recommend it very highly in the winter. That it's the 80-degree communist sun is as nice as the 80-degree any other sun. And it's a very pleasant place to go for a vacation, and a very interesting place. So maybe in the next couple months when tourism opens, I'm sure you'd be welcome. And I recommend very highly that you go there and see for yourselves. And I'll be glad to take any questions. Yes?
I got a question about the diversification of the agricultural economy that
Right.
we've seen in Cuba economy based on tobacco and sugar. Is there any motion to change that so that they raise more of their own food instead of being reliant on sugar?
Well, you know, they tried that. They tried to get away from the sugar economy in the early 60s, and Che came in and tried to industrialize it. And it was just a miserable failure. And they have finally come to the terms of the fact that they are a country whose economy will be based on sugar. They have professionalized their sugar cane cutting army. The amateurs do not cut cane because they destroy the cane and they don't do it very well. It's mechanized. And the criteria they use for diversification is quite simply, can the crop that's grown on that piece of land make more money than if sugar were grown on that land? And if that's true, then they grow it. There's a major emphasis on citrus fruits now. Hundreds of thousands of acres are now planted in citrus fruits, and in the next couple of years they'll begin to bear financial fruit as they begin to export it. So that's, perhaps soybeans also may be a new crop. Rice, they're trying to expand and become self-sufficient. They import huge quantities of rice. But in terms of really any serious displacement, they are locked into sugar, which is tough because the sugar prices are way down and they're having a drought and their production is down and they're in some economic trouble now. In the back. Well, what I'm doing is working, as you say, with American companies who want to get ready for trade. You can't do any direct trade now, so it's a question of their going down and feeling out the potential, quite frankly, for making money off of trade. Cuba's interest is in talking to American companies to find out what they offer. It's been 17 years since there's been contact between Cuban trade people and American companies. The Cuban traders, the foreign trade ministry people are all new. They see the advent of commercial ties and are interested in now reaching out and trying to find not only what is available, but from whom they can get the things that they know is available. And I think their interest is they're not afraid of U.S. companies, and U.S. companies will go in on a very different basis than they were there before. There will be no ownership. However, there is potential for joint ventures and participation and some form of investment this side of ownership. The Cuban economy, I think, is at a stage where their agricultural industrial development has gone basically as far as it can go with Eastern European technology. And the U.S. Companies, the U.S. business community, has made technological advances that are far superior to many other people and provide products and services that are the best in the world. particularly in the field of agriculture, in the field of fertilizers, agricultural chemicals, seeds, which Cuba cannot get anywhere else. In medicines, too, is a high priority. You just cannot buy the medicines that the U.S. makes from anywhere else in the world. They're the best medicines in the world. They have, I think, a slightly inflated view of American technology. As they say, there's a Spanish word, there's a Cuban word called know-how, which has existed, which has gone through and is now a Cuban word, American know-how. Has a reputation, perhaps a little bit inflated than what it is, but they want American know-how. And they want Americans to come down and help build plants and do their shipping and sell them grains. And there are direct economic savings involved. It's a lot cheaper to buy grains from Louisiana, New Orleans, than it is from China. Just the shipping costs alone are huge. The impact, I think, that's difficult to measure. People ask, will the advent of U.S. relations have an impact on the Soviet-Cuban relations? Probably to some extent in terms of the economic dependence. And I think socially, when you have trade, when you have Americans down there, whether they be technicians or businessmen or traders, when you begin opening up a communication with people who know no communication and have had none with Americans, one would hope that this would have a salutary effect on the relations between the two countries and the two peoples so that they understand one another better. And I think it will. Yes?
Just looking in the future, but what problems would you see for Cuba when the day arrives that Castro is replaced by his death or the advent of a successor? Because like he seems to be so influential in all major decisions.
Well, he's about 51 years old. And one, I guess, can assume, barring unforeseen events, that he's going to live and be in power for quite a few more years. If he should die tomorrow of a heart attack, his brother would, who is second in everything, would, I think, get out of one chair and stand up and sit down in the other chair. And I don't, there would be a big difference in style, but in terms of the internal workings of the country, I think they would go on without losing much of a step. He has tried to minimize his role. In other words, there's no cult of personality, as you might find in China, with Mao, for example. There are no big posters of Fidel, and there are no little red books of Fidel's sayings. And there are very few pictures in offices, in government offices, where you would see pictures of heads of state, and even in this country, you don't see very many pictures of Fidel. So there's very little cult of personality. Nevertheless, his personality is very pervasive and just is all over the country. He no longer makes the spontaneous decisions that he made before. He used to drive around the countryside and say, that looks like a nice place for a school. Well, 2 weeks later, they'd start building a school there. He doesn't do that anymore. There's a great deal more care, and the workings of the government are much more institutionalized. It has created a bureaucracy, and some things move slower than perhaps they did before. And in the last year, this gets very complicated. We can go into it later, and I won't take up your time with it now. There's been a whole reshuffling of the whole country, the whole geographical divisions of the country, the whole governmental structure is just all brand new. The purpose of which is to institutionalize the process of government. And it's just starting, so it's difficult to know how it's going to work out. If it works out, the process of selecting a head of state will flow out of that new structure. So one can only guess as to whether one day in the future you're going to have the the power struggles that are so common in other communist countries, or whether this process will indeed produce, this new structure will produce a process which is capable of doing that. I don't know. That's a difficult question. I suspect that the process will work pretty well. Cuba from what one knows of the people around Fidel and the leaders of the country don't strike one as being the power broker types for some reason. It would be very strange to see a power struggle. Yes?
How does the government distribute the wealth or lack of wealth? Is there a system of taxation?
No, there's no everybody gets a government check. It's a one-company town. The barber gets a government check, the waiter gets a company check, the farmer gets a company check, the taxi driver gets a company check. Everybody except a few small landowners, or landowners who own small pieces of land, get company checks, state checks, or cash. I mean, I don't know what the document is. I don't know if it's a check or cash. I mean, therefore, there's a great withholding system. Everything is withheld. There is no taxation. And there is a salary scale. And it ranges from about, I guess, $180 a month to $700 a month. Government ministers get $700. Medical professors get $700. And the $150 to $180, would be the bottom end of the scale. Factory work, if I had to pick an average, I'd say it's around $250 to $300, probably. And there's just I haven't seen it, but the waiter in this hotel gets the same as the waiter in a hotel in another city. There is a class of waiter, there's a class of worker, there's a class of minister, and that scale is all set, and you're handed your money. And you can have savings accounts, and you can put it in the bank, you can put it in your shoebox, and you go out and you have your ration card, and you buy whatever you can buy that month. You can save your money and put it in banks, and people do. And in fact, Cuba lowered the price of some of the luxury goods because everybody was saving too much money, and they wanted to get the money back into circulation. So it's easy and it's cumbersome. For example, the state, just to give you an idea about a restaurant, for example, Fidel mentioned it would be, as one comment, it would be confusing for an American to see a socialist restaurant. The state sells the restaurant the food, let's say the steak, for X. The restaurant puts a price on it of Y. You, the consumer, go in and pay Y. Y goes to the restaurant. The restaurant pays the state. Well, the restaurant is the state, because the restaurant's not privately owned, so there's a lot of paper shuffling. But that restaurant has a budget, and that restaurant is not supposed to lose money. So internally they sort of treat it as if the restaurant were privately owned, but it's really part of this column of the state apparatus, selling food to you, which it has bought from the other column of the state apparatus. So it's a great circle. The money just goes in and out of the state bank account, because wherever you spend it, you're giving it back to the state. You go to the nightclubs are owned by the state. So the state gives you the money, and you're just shoveling it right back. So it's a great circular motion. Yeah. I'm not an expert on revolutions. I don't really know. I'm a little bit out of my field. I mean, I can talk about the Cuban Revolution, but comparing it to Russia or China, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that. From what I've heard, just the end result of the Chinese, and talking to people who've been to China, and also talking to people who have been to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the China and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe are much colder, much more, much grayer, much more sameness. Much more regimented. There's a great Latin flavor in Cuba. It is, Che had an expression, he said, he said, socialismo con pachanga, which means socialism with pachanga, which is a Latin dance. He says, we want a socialism but at the same time we want the Latin verve in the socialism. You don't find, for example, dormitory barracks for vacationing workers like you have in the Black Sea. There aren't group vacations. There aren't mass thises and that's. People, there is a degree of individuality in the clothes and the style and the vacations, and that is pretty free-flowing. And the colors and sort of the Latin atmosphere, which from people, I've not been to China or Russia, but from people who have been to all three places, that is the main difference that they're struck by. Let me get somebody who hasn't. Yes? Go ahead, yeah.
My question relates to what has the Cuban government done to solve the race problem? And if they haven't, why haven't?
That's a good question. And it has contradictory answers. Socially, the country is about 20 to 25% black, maybe about 25% white, and the rest are shades in between. Socially, there is no apparent racism at all. Blacks and whites and browns and whites and all shades and colors, all intermingling, intermarrying. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any social barrier there. There doesn't seem to be any employment barrier. In other words, black, white, in the middle, in terms of being doctors or technicians or schooling, there appears to be no barriers there. On the other hand, you get into the higher echelons of the government, into some of the ministerial levels, and there is an absence of blacks. Now, I'm not here to offer it's difficult for me, I'm not a spokesman for Cuba. I mean, I can't, I'm not going to try to rationalize why. My guess as to why is that before, there was a very strong racism. So strong that Batista, who was a mulatto, who was dictator of the country, was not allowed as a member of the yacht club because that was reserved for whites. I mean, that's pretty strong. So you're dealing in a segment of the population which was really squashed down. And if you take 17 years, how long does it take if those people have to start from ground zero? And Fidel Castro's been in 17 years. The majority of the blacks with the education are now 17 to 25, or let's say 17 to 30. And indeed in the lower levels, you see a great many more blacks and browns than you do at the upper levels. And the only explanation is that it just takes time for that new education to take over. In fact, when I was there 2 weeks ago, I had a talk with a guy, and they were talking about the Venceremos Brigade, which is groups of American sugarcane cutters that go down, and they've talked about people who bring up the question of quotas, who talk about, well, look at your political bureau. You got one black there. Why don't you have more blacks there? They reject the idea that you go out and look for so many blacks and so many women and so many thises and so many that's, happens in our country, and particularly in political parties. They just reject that out of hand as being absolute nonsense. They will say, we are not a racist country, there is no racism, and the fact that there is one black and 12 on the political bureau is just because that's the way it is. Well, the argument sort of stops there, but I think it's pretty good. Eldridge Cleaver has great differences with that. I mean, he lived in Cuba and claims that it's a very racist society. Huey Newton is still there and claims that it isn't, so pick your Black Panther. Yeah. Church is of no impact whatsoever. They are allowed to function. They are supported where they're needed to be supported, and there are synagogues and Catholic churches and Protestant churches. The priests can do any religious thing they want. The only restriction, no politics. But you go to the churches and nobody's there. It is just non-existent. People just don't go, except a few old people. Yeah.
Any questions
Right.
subject to black market. In many
Yep.
countries, we do hear about black markets. Do they have a black market?
Yeah, there is a black market. I don't know much about it. I've asked to see it, but no one will take me to see it. There is a black market. How big, I don't know. I don't think it's that big. Well, it seems to work pretty well in terms of bureaucracy, or people are so used to it that they just accept the bureaucratic hang-ups. You don't see the long lines that you once saw. They adopted, everybody would show up in one day to shop. Well, they now have given you the way we did with gas a couple of years ago, you know, with your license plate. You go on, you're assigned certain days, so you don't have long lines. So they've tried to make it, they've tried to take some steps. The black market, there is a black market. And how big it is, I don't know. How widespread, I don't know, but it's there. It's not so big, I guess, that it hasn't been eliminated. If Fidel, I mean, everybody knows it exists. That means Fidel knows it exists. And if he really thought it was a threat, he has adequate resources to take care of it. And he hasn't. It may even serve his purpose. I mean, he may want a little black market to go on. Maybe, you know, maybe that's healthy for a country. I don't know. Yeah.
As you go out into the countryside, as you get into the more remote mountainous areas away from Havana, do you find more people living in more of a self-sufficient manner, less influenced?
Well, you saw some of the houses there. I mean, some of the, what they're called bohillos, some of the, I mean, they're thatched roof and they're, you know, very poor houses. And you find a number of small farmers. To sell your land to the state is purely voluntary, below a certain level. All the land above a certain size was nationalized. I don't know what, I forget what the size was. But below that, it's purely voluntary, and indeed is. And some people have decided to keep their own land, and they farm their land, they sell their produce to the state, and they're now allowed to go into their own business. They're allowed now to sell their produce to their neighbors. And even, just as to digress for a minute, as effective a couple months ago, even people in Havana who are plumbers, electricians who do a service are allowed to moonlight and set up their own little entrepreneurial business and get whatever money they can get for their trade. But in the rural areas, it's, there's a great deal more food because people grow it there. People are self-sufficient, and they try to bring, they're trying to bring in the people from the, you know, the really remotest areas into more centralized towns where there are the social services. Some people just reject that.
So you do find a flow of population from the countryside into the city?
Planned. In other words, there was a great migration into Havana. And there's people still go in there. All the schools, not all, I mean, the great majority of the schools, hospitals are now being built out in the countryside to keep people down on the farm. But within the rural areas where you have a little bohillo way up there and one way up there and one down the road here and one over there, I mean, it's a tremendous work to string electric lights and sewers and roads and everything else, so where they have isolated, tiny little communities, they create a rural town or a rural community, or try to. And they indeed build the community and have the new apartments and the schools and the hospitals there. Then people decide whether they want to leave that bohillo and come in and live in the new community, and some people decide they don't want to. And they're left alone. Who suffers are the kids, because, again, gets back to the peer pressure. The kids go to school in that new community, because that's the only school, and they're sort of left out a little bit. And the government feels that sooner or later the older people are going to die, and the kids will be left, and the kids, gradually, those little farms will be sold off. But 80% of the tobacco crop for the cigars is grown by private farmers. All right, you pointed to one, I pointed to one. Okay, too quick. Okay, go ahead.
Cuba is a sugar economy because of the Soviet policy.
Because, no, I don't think so. I mean, the Soviet Union does not need sugar. I mean, it's one of the world's greatest producers of sugar. It's not a question of that they necessarily need the sugar. They do support the sugar crop. In other words, they're paying, the world price of sugar is now 7 or 8 cents a pound. The Soviet Union pays Cuba 30 cents a pound for half their sugar crop. The country is so dominated by sugar, and the land has been devoted for so long to sugar, that the thought of, the earlier question, the thought of digging that sugar up and planting something else is just unthinkable. I don't think it's a question of the Soviet Union demanding that Cuba get into sugar or stay into sugar. Haven't heard that. And there'd be no particular reason for it. Somebody had a question back in this area.
Around what issues does political dissension take place, and what form does that take?
Well, it gets down to the simplest way to describe it is that there is total freedom to criticize the actions of the government within the system of the government. It is not allowed to attack the system of the government. In other words, if you're let's say you're a factory worker and making cement in a cement factory, and your factory, it sort of filters down, is given a quota for so many tons of cement per whatever it is, year, and you break down into months and weeks and days. And the factory workers, this is actually what happens, the plan comes down from the top to the factory. The factory workers get together and decide whether they will accept that plan. If they feel that they cannot meet that quota, they therefore cannot accept the plan and will send their rejection back up. Within that context, and within the context of the working conditions, the health conditions, the conditions of the housing, the this, the that, whatever aspect of your life, the rationing is too small, we ought to have more of this, it can't get in the nightclub, and any aspect of the complaints, however trivial or serious about your daily life, it's open season. Real democracy, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and go on, that's, if you got on a soapbox, you wouldn't be hauled off to jail. I mean, somebody would come up and talk to you and say, look, Charlie, settle down, you know, what were you trying to do? But if you began organizing groups around that thought and running off on your little mimeograph machine, if you had one, a little pamphlet saying why the socialist system and the government of Castro doesn't work and should be abolished, you wouldn't do that very long. And if you kept on doing it, you'd get into serious trouble. But to complain within the system about anything in any aspect of the system, that's okay, and people do. And I've seen people go up to Fidel and start complaining. I mean, about things that, you know, Fidel, this doesn't work, and this doesn't work, and this is run badly, and this factory doesn't work, and we can't get the trucks, and we can't get the cement, and you promised this, and the government promised that, and the government isn't delivering this, and this isn't work, Fidel. And we talked to somebody 2 months ago about these bus routes, and they aren't working. He gets worried and says something to an aide who writes down, presumably goes and does something about it. I don't know what happens, but that's okay. It's a thin line, but it may be thin, but it's very clear. You don't find very many people doing that. Thank you very much.